Assalamu alaikum, namaste. Good evening, everyone out there in the diaspora, and especially in Guyana. We hope everyone is staying safe. We would like to welcome you once again to another Globespan program. Globespan is produced by Mr. Noahar Singh and the technical crew led by Devin, who are operating out of Richmond Hill, Queens, New York. If you recall, last Wednesday, we had two prominent guests here on this show. We're here again today. At the last session, last Wednesday, we talked about some of the historical, causes of the problem that we find ourselves in. So the title of this show today would be, as we've said, A Nation Divided. So to give you some kind of focus, we would like to continue with that discussion. But tonight, we would like to focus more on the current situation, but more importantly, talk about how we can actually move forward. In other words, what are some proposals for taking this nation forward so we can establish some kind of political nirvana where conflict will be minimized. So that's our focus if you're joining us. And again, our guest tonight is Dr. David Hinds and Mr. Ravi Dev. We do have some technical difficulties. As you know, we're trying to, dealing with technology, but hopefully he can join us pretty soon. So I want to give you an introduction to our guests. And hopefully there are things that you would find about our guests that you may not know. So let's start off with Dr. Hinds. Dr. Hinds is an associate professor at Arizona State University. He specializes in Caribbean and African diaspora studies with an emphasis on race and ethnicity, political history, governance, and popular culture. He has authored 3 books and has written several articles in academic journals. Dr. Hinds' activism, and as you all know, he's very actively involved in Guyana, is grounded in advocacy for the poor and the powerless, for ethno-racial equality. He is an active member of the WPA, and he has been so for the last 40 years. Many Guyanese also know him as a newspaper columnist, and his views are generally widely quoted in the print and electronic media. People may not know this, but Dr. Hinds was arrested, and he spent time in jail opposing the PNC regime. David is from the popular village of Buxton, Guyana. Mr. Dev, who we're hoping will join us soon, just to give you a sort of introduction to his background. Mr. Dev has a BSc in economics. He's a Juris Doctor. He was a member of the New York Bar. He was also a corporate executive in Manhattan. He was also an entrepreneur, a business person. He owned an apartment building in Queens and a supermarket in the Bronx in New York. Quite a bit of wealth was accomplished, I guess. Mr. Dev decided to chuck it all in, gave everything up in New York, and he left for Guyana. And he has been living in Guyana since 1989. While there, he formed a group called the Jaguar Committee for Democracy to advocate for free and fair election. And later, he formed a political party called ROAR. He was a member of parliament. Mr. Dev, as most people will know in Guyana, writes for the Guyana Times. He hails from the village of Ifluct, actually Ifluct pasture. Again, if you just joined us, we are continuing our discussion regarding the ethnic politics or the division in Guyana. And our focus tonight will be on how do we resolve, how do we address this issue. And just to remind our audience, every rope, as I say in Guyana, got 2 ends. So if you're going to have a debate, you want to have a debate with people who represent different narratives. And Guyana obviously is a divided nation. So having said that, Dr. Hinds, good evening.
Good evening, Dr. Ramharack.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a question. We are now 50 days since election as of today. A lot of people are pissed off, to use that phrase. India has a population or voting population of 900 million, right? It takes them a month to kind of compile the results. So we're here 50 days after we can't get a result, in terms of what happened, the actual verified result. So, but before I get to that, I want to ask you a question about what you wrote in the newspaper a few weeks back. But my first question to you is Dr. David Hinds a racist?
Well, I teach about racism. I'm teaching a class this semester called Race and Racism in the African Diaspora. And I teach my students what is racism and who can be a racist. And the popular definition of a racist is one who believes in the supremacy of his or her race, racial supremacy or racial supremacy. I, 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 um, I, I am not a racial supremacist. In fact, I belong to a quote unquote race that has been and continues to be the victim of racial supremacy. I like to be a contradiction in terms for victims of racial supremacy to themselves be advocates of racial supremacy. Oh no, not at all. But in Guyana, we have developed a simplistic definition of what a racist is. Once somebody says, I love my race or my ethnicity, that person becomes a racist. Because in post-colonial Guyana, we developed this kind of overarching nationalism that we call the Guyanese nationalism. And the theoretical foundation of that nationalism is that you cease to be your ethnicity, you cease to be Amerindians, you cease to be Portuguese, Chinese, Africans, and so forth. So anyone that says, I am Indo-Guyanese or I'm Afro-Guyanese, I'm Amerindian, and I love being that, that person is seen as being outside of accepted norms, outside of polite company. So in a sense, what we've done over a period of time is that we have weaponized ethnic identity. And so in that sense, I can understand people think that somebody like myself, who I don't look around, I don't shy of saying, I am African Guyanese, I'm a black man, and I'm proud of that. But I know that's not all I am, you know. When I'm in Guyana, nobody asks me, are you a Guyanese? When I'm in Guyana, I'm a Bostonian. That's what I am, that's my identity, all right? And I leave Guyana and I go to Trinidad, and they ask where you're from. I then become a Guyanese. And then I come to New York and they say, where you from? I'm from the Caribbean. I come to Arizona. I become a black person. One is painting all these identities. And so I am equally proud of all of those identities. But if people want to say that I'm a racist for convenient reasons, there's nothing I can do about that.
All right. Now, Mr. Dev has joined us. So, you know, one of the things I'm going to ask you guys, I'm in a tough spot here because you guys have a great knowledge of history. So I'm going to fight with both of you to keep your comments. You know, if you can limit it, keep it brief, because we do have some others, you know, who will come on later and ask some questions. So, you know, if you can make your point, and as I said, you know, just stick to the point, and then we can move on so we can get a lot of questions in tonight. So, Mr. Dev, before you join us, I just introduce you, your background, and I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a question. It's a simple question. You know, when you look at Guyana's ethnic composition, neighboring Trinidad has an almost similar ethnic makeup, right? Last week we talked about the history of the conflict. So my question to you is, you know, if Trinidad has a very similar makeup and they have had very stable, you know, free and fair elections and without any kind of violence and so on, what is it about Guyana, you know, that creates a situation we're in today? But more specifically, I would like you to respond to the question. Let's assume that the verification is over. Let's assume that the PPP wins this election based on the number. Would you, Mr. Dev, would you say, or would you agree that the PNC, let me put it this way, do you think the PNC will allow, and I picked that word specifically, allow the PPP to govern Guyana?
I think that's a key question, and we're answering this almost in real time. It's a real pertinent question that all Guyanese must answer. And as you said, we have to keep this thing short, but I just want to say this. Everything is historically grounded. Things just doesn't pop out of the sky. So you have to look at antecedents to say where we are. So for example, for me to answer your question as to what the PNC will do, at a minimum, one has to look at the PNC's history and then see what they've done in the past, and will they do the same thing or will they change? Because history does change. Everything is not fixed, but it gives you some kind of clue as to what may. So my firm belief is that when in 1964, the PNC could, well, before that election, they complained that the system of voting, which was first past to post, would never make them win. It overrepresented the PPP because Indians were spread geographically more than Afro-Guyanese. So the PPP would always win by that electoral system. The British changed the system to proportional representation. And Duncan Sands, the colonial secretary, said why he changed it. And this is very pertinent to those who are calling for power sharing and call for changes in the Constitution and all these things, because we have gone through this with the PNC and the PPP. So Duncan Sands changed the system of our electoral system to proportional representation, and he gave the reasons why. He said, in a plural society, proportional representation will allow each group to be represented proportionately. That's what it means, proportional representation. But since we have several ethnic groups, the vote will be fractured. Therefore, it will encourage coalition building. Typically, now this is one of the modern innovations, that there should be coalition building, and that's what this whole call for power sharing is coming up to. So Mr. Burnham did in fact, and the PPP, after fighting it tooth and nail, did go along with the 64 elections and did in fact lose, because the PNC, Duncan Sands' prediction was correct. You had the UF getting, I believe, 12%, and the PNC with about 42%. They coalesced and they formed a government. You would have thought, therefore, Guyana had solved its historic fears of the Afro-Guyanese community. But what Mr. Burnham did by 68, because the whole point about coalition government, and if we are to go forward in any kind of shared government or shared governance model, one of the requisites put forward by theorists like Liphart and others is that the partners have to be willing to bargain and to compromise and to accept this other partner. Mr. Burnham refused to accept the UF and the US and the US policies. To say what we might have been is something else, and I want to stop this now. So the point I'm saying, in 64, the PNC refused coalition government because it wanted to govern on its own. It then rigged the next 3 elections. And the excuse has been, as many have put out, that the PNC would have been, and its constituency would have been paralyzed perpetually. And in fact, our group said that. But at the time Mr. Burnham started rigging, Indians were not an absolute majority. So the point is now, when we come back to subsequent elections, the PNC has never shown that it will accept. In 92, there were riots, and only a call from the White House had Mr. Hoyt step down, and Mr. Green and David Granger never ever forgave him for that. Granger was in the swing at that time. In 1997, the same thing happened. You had riots in the streets. Herd Manson Accord produced changes, gentlemen, in terms of whether the PNC would accept. You had the PPP truncating its terms of office by 2 years. You had more power given to Parliament, to the opposition in Parliament, parliamentary sectorial committees. You had all kinds of rights commission. The PNC still refused to accept that. In 2001 election, again protested. And up to today, until 2011, when you had the PPP loss because of demographic change. To come back to it, I think that the PNC, some people can talk about elements in the PNC or what have you, but we are dealing with the PNC at this stage. And the PNC, in my estimation, will not accept this change if the PPP were to be voted in. I do not believe firmly that it will accept it. It's not in its makeup to do so.
Well, so then what if the verification process, let's say if it's, when it's complete, if it shows that the PNC or the coalition has lost, are you saying that they will refuse to hand over power? Is that
yes.
A yes or no?
I believe they will refuse to hand over power.
All right. But let me ask you this as a follow-up. What has basically changed in this election compared to previous election? And I want you to focus on the fact that, keep in mind, based on the argument you're making, if the PPP was in office for 23 years, right? If they were in office for 23 years, why couldn't they have taken actions to prevent a situation like this from happening?
Well, I wouldn't venture to talk about what made the PPP do what it did or did not. Way back in '62, Fenton Ramsey made a famous comment that the party, meaning the PPP, moves in mysterious ways. So I would not want to go into that mindset. But what I can say is that when leaders make decisions, and all of this come back to the strategy that the leadership will take, leaders will have to look at the resources that are at their command versus the sanctions that can be brought upon them. In the past and up to today, the resources at the command of the PNC has been the army, the police, the bureaucracy, and the control of Georgetown from a strategic standpoint, where it can always have some of its supporters come out in riots. So when a PNC leader makes a decision, he always will consider those factors. Now, when you look at a PPP leader making that decision, as the PPP, whether they say they led to the riots recently when the vote was disagreed with, they rioted outside of Georgetown. So in that sense, it doesn't make, it's like a tree fall in the middle of a forest. Nobody heard, did it actually fall? No, it didn't change anything. But if something were to happen like what Mr. Hoyt did in 1997 after the elections, he could bring out protests, buildings could be burnt in Georgetown, there could be riots, Indians could be beaten in the streets of Georgetown, and the PPP was brought to its knees, where CARICOM had to come in and have the Herd Manson Accord. So that's the difference. Let me just finish this. As to why the PPP didn't change anything, because there was a discipline force commission. Mr. Granger was part of that commission, and the commission recommended that the forces be more representative of the population of Guyana. And if that had been altered, then the PPP and the PNC would have been playing with different resource base as to what they can command.
So we don't want to lose our audience, right? So I'm just emphasizing again, as a moderator, I know it's difficult to explain things in an hour and a half, but if you can kind of just make your point and keep it a little brief, because like I said, I'll be fighting with you guys. So David?
No, but I want to say this though. I want to say this. We are in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic that is killing people. Yesterday and today, I attended 3 remote funerals. 3. An hour ago, I finished with 1 in New York City. And if we don't take time to understand what is the coronavirus, then we'll never be able to deal with it. So, for instance, if to just say, let's give a 2 minute, a 2 sentence on our dilemma. Now, I'm not expecting the ordinary person to understand that, but if you know what the coronavirus is, you will know it has a lipid surface. If it has a lipid surface, then you know soap, lipid means soap, lipid means fat, then soap will dissolve a lipid. Now, the ordinary man might need to do it, all of the things, wash your hands. So, but I'm expecting that you have leaders who have to understand what David and I are talking about. And to talk about cutting it short and all that, well, I don't know how you can cut this thing into sound bites.
I'm not asking to cut it short. I'm just asking if you guys can kind of, keep it more concise. All right. So let me ask David a question now. And I'm going to come back to some of the things you said, Mr. Dev. But David, you have made some statements, in one of the newspaper articles you wrote saying that we need to scrap the election and burn the ballot box. And you also, there was another statement which was reported by the Guyana Chronicle on April 14th. Basically, it says that you, David Hinds, was calling for a comprehensive audit, not necessarily a recon, but a comprehensive audit. So my question to you, David, is if power sharing and all of these concerns were not a concern in 2015, why should it be a concern in 2020?
I'm surprised you didn't ask Ravi if he's a racist, because a lot of African Guyanese believe that Ravi Dev is a racist, and you asked me to defend myself against being racist, and you didn't ask Ravi. So you're assuming that they don't think Ravi is a racist. I can tell you, African Guyanese think that Ravi is a racist, and I happen to think they're wrong, and I always tell them they're wrong. I don't know if anybody tell Indian Guyanese they're wrong when they say David Hinds is a racist. But anyhow.
Okay, but I'm going to bring that. I'm going to have him answer that question. He off with the coronavirus thing, so I got a little confused with that.
Yeah. I noticed you said that I said burn the boxes, and I can't remember reading that anyway. I may not remember my own self, but I can't remember reading it except your letter. Did I say burn the boxes?
What about scrapping the elections?
I said scrap the election, destroy the boxes, and an interim government of the two parties. They're meant to be taken together.
Okay.
Right? If you're scrapping an election, you're obviously doing away with all that election thing. That is the spirit in which I said destroy the boxes. And I wasn't saying stop the election, scrap the election, and let's carry on. I said what to do in its place. All right? And I didn't say what to do in its place, excluding one group. I said what to do in its place, including both groups. And I think it's important when we are talking about these things to put them in their proper perspective. You yourself, Ravi just said, in 1997, the PPP agreed to scrap 2 years of its mandate. I'm not being innovative. All right? I'm not being innovative. In 2018, the PPP through a no confidence vote technically made the coalition scrap a year and a half of its vote, of its tenure. This whole notion of democracy and you don't make compromises and so on is nonsense. Our history has shown that whenever the parties, their backs are against the wall, they agree to subvert their own victories. And so I am not being malicious when I ask, in effect, for a postponement of the 2020 elections to 2 years from now, because I said the interim government should be for 2 years. And I'm saying, if you have a disputed election, which I think is going the consequences of which I think is going to be horrendous. I am thinking that we can avoid that by postponing this election for 2 years while we sort out the underlying problems that we have. It is in that spirit that I made the proposal. Right?
Yes, but David, what I'm saying is your party, the WP, is part of the coalition, and you campaigned, in 2020, 2019 on behalf of this, coalition. If this is an issue in 2020, why wasn't it an issue before the election? Why is it a problem now? So what I guess what I'm asking you is it a concern now to create a government of national unity because there are people who believe that the PPP has won this election?
I'm not representing the WPA here. I'm not representing the coalition. I make it emphatic.
I'm asking as a member of the WPA.
I am very clear. I'm a public person. I'm an activist. All right? And there are times when I represent the party that I belong to, and I say so. And there are times, most of the times, I don't represent my party views. All right? I'm an independent thinker and an independent actor. And I come on this program not as a representative of the WPA and the coalition. I come here in my own capacity as a Guyanese who has been saying things about our country and as one who's concerned about the future of the country. So don't ask me to represent WPA and coalition. If you want me to come back on another program to do that, I will come. But tonight I don't want to do that.
But David, I'm asking that question based on a comment that you made in one of your columns. And there was a quotation, as I said, in the Chronicle, which basically said that you are asking for a comprehensive audit.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. In 2015, you're asking about 2015. In 2015, I supported the coalition partly on the grounds that the coalition agreed to a government of national unity. So if you're asking where was David Hinds in 2015, was he not? Yes, I campaigned in 2015 on a shared governance or power sharing. So I'm not coming with power sharing in 2020 when I didn't say anything in 2015. After the 2015 election, to be fair to the coalition, it did set in train the mechanism for a government of national unity. It set up a committee headed by Nigel Hughes, Ravi and myself, gave testimony before that committee. Mr. Granger said that he was inviting the PPP to join him in a government. He's on record as saying that. The PPP never responded. We have to get our facts straight when we are making these things. Between 2015 and 2019, I went back and did research on myself. And there were 18 instances. It's there on Google. Many of them are in the Guyana Times, where David Hinds was brutally critical of the coalition for not pursuing shared governance. So better this question that I'm raising shared governance now when I never raised it, it's untrue. I campaigned on it in 2015. I followed through with it in terms of participating in the limiting process that the coalition started. And then when the coalition dropped the ball, I was brutally critical of them. So it's untrue, and I think sometimes we have to do our homework before we start throwing these dead cats and dead dogs across the fence.
And I appreciate you clarifying this. And it is a conversation as it is, right? And I'm glad you're clarifying. So before I get to Mr. Dev and the question.
No, let me answer the other question. I call for a comprehensive. I call for a comprehensive recount. Listen, my attitude to what's going on is that this is a disputed election. One side, the PPP says it's win, it has won. The coalition said that it has won. David Hinds has not called the winner, right? I've never said the coalition won. I've never said the PPP PPP one. In my estimation, this is a disputed election. The PPP saying they've seen things in the Region 4 tabulation that leads them to believe that it was massively rigged. The coalition said they've seen things in Region 3 and Region 6 and Region 2, which they think they're going to uncover in the boxes. All right? And so both sides are claiming victory. I'm saying that I am interested not in who wins, insofar as there's going to be a recount, and I don't even think we will get to the end of a recount, but that's another conversation. But insofar as we're going to have a recount, I think that recount should unearth not a victor, it should unearth fraud. Because we are going to a recount because there have been charges of fraud. And so I am not interested in the recount leading to the PPP winning or the coalition winning. I'm interested in the recount leading to the fraud that both sides are claiming. And I think the way you unearth that fraud is that you have a comprehensive audit. Right? So again, depends on what outcome you're thinking about. If you're thinking if you want an outcome to prove that the PPP win, then you're going to come to Region 4 and then discard the other boxes. If you
let me ask you this. I hear what you're saying, but one of the things, and again, I'm not here to ask any one of you soft questions. We want to hear what you want, and you guys are being brutally honest, and I appreciate that. Now, Vincent Alexander, and I just need your opinion on this. He said, and I'm trying to quote him accurately, that this investigation or the recount is to find, discrepancies, and it's not necessarily intended to declare a winner. Would you, David Hinds, support that position?
Vincent is speaking as a commissioner, so they have to declare winners, right? I am not in the business of declaring a winner. That's what I said. I'm not interested in the winner or loser here, Betaram. I'm coming from a different perspective. I think whether the coalition wins or is declared the winner, because I don't think we're winning, whether the coalition is declared the winner at the end of quote-unquote recount, or whether the PPP is declared the winner at the end of quote-unquote recount, I do not see that solving the problem. I see an exacerbation of the problem. And at this point, I am thinking, how do we prevent that? How do we prevent that exacerbation, right? I think we've got to do some engineering. And it is in that context that I throw my proposal out there for an interim government, which is not unique. We've had interim governments in Guyana. The PNC 1990, yes, the PNC 90 to 92 government was an interim government.
All right.
It was an interim government of two parties. It was an interim government of one party. So we have had interim governments. Only yesterday we are hearing of an interim government in Israel, of all places, and so forth. So my proposal for an interim government is not about...
David, before you get to that, I want to save that for our next part of the discussion. I'll come back to that. But to be fair, and you did raise the issue, Mr. Dev wasn't on, joined us late, so I'm going to ask you the same question. Is Ravi Dev a racist? I don't know if you can hear me, but we can't hear you. I think we can hear you now.
Okay. I said you're asking a question analogous to the one where they ask you if you've stopped beating your wife. You answer the question, you're damned if you do or damned if you don't. Well, let me just say this, that way back decades now, I put forward my view of Guyana, and I called it a tragedy. What we have in Guyana is a tragedy. But not tragedy in what people would normally think about. Tragedy in how Hegel described tragedy, which is that you have a situation where both sides are right. Both sides have rights. And the tragedy is that neither side takes the time to acknowledge the rights of the other side. We only hold on to our rights. This is our right, and we don't look at the other side. African Guyanese do it, and Indo-Guyanese do it. Coming back to whether I'm a racist or not, that has guided my whole praxis in Guyana, because I come from a tradition where the greatest war of all times, in my tradition, the Mahabharata, both sides were right. Just like Hegel. Hegel reviewed Antigone, the Greek play, but I reviewed the Mahabharata. And both sides, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, were both right, but neither gave the other side. And it was a fratricidal war that ended in the complete annihilation of the tribe that produced God himself, Bhagwan Krishna. So what I'm saying, if you don't address this issue, you'll all have to perish. Even Hegel said the hero has to die. Krishna had to die. So coming back to Guyana, I have always tried to look at both sides. So when I came up with the ethnic security dilemmas, I didn't only speak of the Indo-security dilemma that we have lived, as V.S. Naipaul said, in the Caribbean, always also unprotected. At any time, somebody could come in to our homes and rape and kill, where Mr. Quine in 85 said it had a flavor of genocide in being so directed to Indo-Guyanese. In the 85, Mr. Quine said that. So we have had to, that's the Indian dilemma, but the African dilemma we have to look at too, as I said last week, that they have literally slaved for this country. And when we look at the politics the politics that we were bequeathed with, majoritarian politics, we have to understand their fears. And in today's newspaper, Takuma wrote a letter there, said, well, the wealth must also be distributed. My friend Nigel Hughes had written a piece where he talked about how is the corn going to be shared. So you're talking of the fears of African Guyanese they're going to be excluded from governance, and that also they'll be excluded from the economic patrimony of this land. Now these are fears. It doesn't matter whether they are real or not. If men define their circumstances as real, they are real in their consequences. And I say to all of those out there, especially Indo-Guyanese, who want to say, let's not listen to the other side, they're a bunch of racists, then let them live with the consequences. Now, I could argue from now till the kingdom come, because I happen to believe, and I'm getting long-winded again, that the fears, to a certain extent, is not real in terms of when you say facts. But people don't react necessarily to fact. They react to what they perceive. And that's why academics have a distinction between history, which is facts, and remembrance, which is what is in your collective memory. So when you listen to the ordinary African out there, and we have to listen to them, there's a real fear as to what is my place in all of this. Now, we can choose to sweep it under the rug, but I'll tell you, with the resources that, as Mr. Kwayana, as Mr. Hoyt had said in '97 about the kith and kin, and as Mr. Ogunsay has spoken much later when he told Afro-Guyanese not to vote, at what the point of voting, and he talks about the thing. We have to that basically we can't ignore these. I'll close with this. When I was head of role and a member of parliament, you were invited to give a talk to the GDF. And the GDF had just been stationed in Buxton because of the riots there. And we had a very frank discussion. I can tell you, those officers were some of the brightest people I have come across. And I'm not being condescending. Very bright, very sharp. And we were very candid that when you tell an African soldier, officer or soldier, and they were in Buxton, to go and shoot somebody out of the same, not only the same class, but the same social background that they come out of. It ain't easy. You understand? We have to understand these dynamics. So all I am saying is that, coming back to whether I'm a racist or not, I have tried throughout my career. I spent more time in the WPA office when I returned to Guyana in the late 80s, all the time. The only party I ever gave a monetary contribution, I'm not saying this like somebody said it's putting people down.
Lalu.
The WPA through us here when I had my supermarket in out in the Bronx. The point is then that we have to ask, just like I asked at the funeral of Wattle. And yes, Ravi Dev's basis was asked to give a eulogy at the funeral of Wattle. That why I asked the question, why is a fellow like Wattle, whom I knew to be a humanist, why was he driven to this extreme to do what he did? The last time I met him was at the 25th anniversary, just before he died, of Walter Rodney's death at Queen's College. And we shook hands and we agreed to disagree. And he said, Ravi, I got to do what I got to do. You understand? But we have to ask the question, why? We have to ask the question, why? So I would say I can't answer the question whether I'm racist or not. My record has to be.
Well, I had to ask that question because David is I did ask the question to David. So, but I think I'm going to step out of my moderator's hat here.
You can,
So, but I would answer that question and say, since I know both of you, I would say, obviously that's a very good answer you gave, and both of you are concerned Guyanese. You come from different tradition, but my point to the audience here is that we have to realize that there are different narratives because we have different people in Guyana. It's not like a one love situation. We can be one love, all Guyanese, but we need to understand the narrative from all sides. And that brings us now to the question that we were trying to focus on tonight, which is the kind of solutions that we need to go ahead from here. So, Dr. Hinds, can you tell us, what you envision and again, I know if I say, can you do it briefly, you'll jump all over me, but okay. But if you can, very briefly, what does this government of national unity entails? And then we can take it from there.
Yeah, Beton, before you go, if a keen journalist is looking at this program, Ravi Dev just give them the headline of the night, whatever happens after now. Ravi Dev said just now that if Indian Guyanese ignore the narrative of the other side, they have to live with the consequences. And I want to join that by saying to African Guyanese, if you want to go ahead and proclaim that you are winners and ignore Indian Guyanese, live with the consequences. I want to join that because I think that is going to be the most profound thing that we can say here tonight. Often, it is not what you do to the other side or for the other side. It's whether you have the capacity to speak to your own side. And I always say that is one of my tests of whether someone is racist or not, or one-sided or not. It's whether you have the capacity to tell your side when it's wrong. I spent the better part of my younger days standing up to government of my side, the black government that looked like me. I never voted PNC, I never joined PNC. I spent my young life and sacrificed my liberty to fight against a black government. Maybe some of the people who don't want to come on this program because David Hinds, the racist and all, didn't know that. All right? I did that. As a young man, I left Buxton and walked into Freedom House and went to Gail Teixeira and the others who had a drama group called Worker Stage. And I said, I want to join because I want to go and speak with the Indian Guyanese. And I was a member of the Worker Stage for 2.5 years. Many people do not know I went and I asked Mrs. Jagan, I said, as a young man, I want to write. Can I write for the Mirror? She said, yes. And I said, I was a stringer for the Mirror for 2 years. I say these things to say, my opposition is to the PPP, not to Indian people. Not to Indian people. I have always reached across because I think there is no Guyana, there is no African Guyanese security if there's not Indian security and Amerindian security. So I just wanted to lay that on the table. And so come to the solution. I think my solution is not original, it is not unique. I am basically putting a proposal on the table that has been constantly put on the table, but that I think is very urgent. I think if one is thinking about a victory after the recount for either of the two parties, I think national reconciliation is dead. Insofar as that they may be thinking about national reconciliation, I think both parties are thinking about national reconciliation with them being in charge. Hence the fight for who will win the election. That if they're pushed to national reconciliation, they will be in charge. And then they will determine what it looks like. At the end of the day, I think if Guyanese is going to have peace, that we have got to settle this problem of who governs. I think the ethnic security dilemma is alive and well. I disagree slightly with Ravi in that regard. I think it's alive and well. And I think every time we come to an election, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. My sense is after this 2020 elections, we have nowhere to hide. I don't see where we can hide after this. And I think we have got to confront this national solution where we first settle this problem of who governs. And my answer to who governs is that we all should govern. And it is in that context that I propose this interim government. So I don't care who is the president and who's the prime minister. I made a proposal because normally in these interim government, the incumbent is usually given the top spot. In Israel, Netanyahu is given the top spot in the interim government. When we first proposed it in 1990, we said that Oich should be the president. When we proposed it again in 1997, we said that Jack Dio should be the president because he was the incumbent. Now, those nitty-gritties don't concern me at this moment. It don't concern me whether they split up the cabinet 50-50 or 60-40. They will work that out. But I think what people like myself should do is to put a solution on the table.
Okay, so this national unity government, can you give us maybe at least 2 or 3 proposals of some specific things that they should address?
Well, the first thing they should address, if they agree to a national government, the first thing they should address is the electoral system. And to put in place an electoral system that guarantees all ethnic inclusion in governance and meaningful inclusion in governance. So I think that's the first thing they should address. The second thing they should address is the question of the electoral machinery. Clearly, GCOM is not the composition of GCOM, the architecture of GCOM. It's not working. And so we have to move to a more independent elections commission. Now, there is never going to be an elections commission that both sides would agree on totally. But we have to move to that point where we have a commission where both sides at least have some kind of respect for an agreement on. I think the interim government should also look at ensuring that there's certain legislation put in place to agree, for us to agree on how we distribute resources. Ravi raised the question of resources, and at the bottom of who governs is who distributes the resources. And with the coming of oil and gas, the stakes are extremely high. And so therefore, One of the things Ravi has talked about it, the impact, ethnic impact statement. I think something like that should become the law. So when you're making big policy, you first of all figure out how will it affect the different ethnic groups. So I think we need progressive legislation in the period of the interim government to ensure that all the groups feel culturally, economically, and politically part of our Guyana.
So, Mr. Dev, if I hear you correctly, you were saying such a government of national unity has to be something that happens after the verification, right? But my question to you, I had an intervention today from Mr. Narayan Singh, who was with the AFC and now with the PPP, and basically his statement was, Roar's proposals for such a government of national unity, if we can call it that, are outdated. How do you respond to that?
Well, a number of things. One, as I said, and David said, we did somewhat, but it's not an inconsequential disagreement. It is very consequential. What I said last week, I want to repeat it here, that history has now overtaken the old security dilemmas. And there was a time when we came out with it in 90 that the Indians had a built-in majority, and on their own they could win elections in perpetuity. That was the Indian dilemma, and the African would be excluded from the executive. But we pointed out then that the Africans, you can never say they don't have power. They have all the power resources, which emboldens their leadership to make claims on one side to back up when they take a particular route. Secondly, and this is very important, there's something called the principle of anticipated reactions. The PPP, when in government, always has to anticipate the reactions of those key institutions of the state, and to a certain large extent, temper their aspirations of what they might want to do. Now, what I want to say is this, I want to bring this to a question. The essential question is this. As Mr. Burnham demonstrated when he rejected the UF in 1968 as a coalition, he could have won again with the UF. But so the question I am asking, as I asked last week, that African Guyanese, and I do not believe this is a matter of anthropological and sociological and even novelistic proof from Mr. Laming, believe that they have a great right to rule Guyana because of the great suffering out of slavery. And as I said last week, forgetting if you want to take an early arrival or prior suffering, the Amerindians who were here before Columbus. So it comes back to, and I will be blunt about this, we have to be blunt here. Are African Guyanese ever prepared to accept a government from another racial group in this country? And up to now, none of them, from Mr. Burnham to Mr. Hoyt to Mr. Granger, have demonstrated that one. So the answer is yes. So for us to move from there to shared governance, David himself just explained earlier why shared governance will not work in Guyana. Mr. Granger signed a solemn covenant. I use the word covenant because he tells me he's biblically minded, Mr. Granger, that is, bow to the drop of a hat in front of pews, and signed a covenant called the Commingsburg Accord. How power will be distributed with his coalition partners, and made a mockery out of that, made into a eunuch, emasculated Nagamutu. The fact that Nagamutu has pretty much taken it with open arms, neither here nor there. Who contracted the Granger's agreement to go into shared? And again, I tell you, because he knows what he can on as his resources. We talk about service. The epitome for civil service was that they will act for the good of the country. Hegel called them the universal class. They serve all. Say that G come right now as a piece of that bureaucracy in all Guyana. Let's call a spade a spade. No. So if Mr. Granger were to be put into, try to say, yes, I'm going to go into government, I think anybody who believes him is going to be stupid and should be somewhere in Burbies, near the Candy Bridge there. There's a little thing they call it Burbies Madhouse. You understand? I am saying he has proven himself to be, to not even play fast and loose with his own sacred agreements. David himself, and you have to give David credit for this, protested that the WPA was not ever consulted within the APNU. So I am saying he has not shown good faith, and anybody would be foolish to enter. But I'm saying the problem is now moot. So that's why I would like to answer the question, what do African Guyanese need? And to see how he delivered, whether it is true, it's only through the panacea shared governance, or maybe through other methods. Take, for example, Ogunse's point today, that the core shared before we can go forward, to use my friend Nigel's point. Of course, yes, I think that the wealth of Guyana must be equitably distributed. But even when it is, will African Guyanese leadership accept that? I'll give you a personal example. In 1997, C.Y. Thomas, a great consternation from moving from a Marxist, he suddenly was a member of ACDA and had a conference called The Plight of the African Guyanese. And he threw out statistics to show, well, Africans were lagging on all kinds of things. And I had a famous debate we had, I won't say famous, a debate we had in the papers, where I said that Dr. Thomas, you are now enlarging the space of comparison. And by doing so, you're making Afro-Guyanese feel much more disenfranchised in the economic sense. Lo and behold, in 1992, there was a household income and expenditure statement. Guyana was 40% poverty overall, Afro-Guyanese was 38, Indo-Guyanese was about 36 or somewhere there. By 1990, when the study came out, Afro-Guyanese had moved the furthest out of all, and it was still the Amerindian Guyanese who were still 70% poverty. In 2006, the same proportion held, that the urban standard of living had gone up. But still in 1999, when the figures, the facts showed that Afro-Guyanese had progressed beyond the other groups, beyond in terms of amount of, they were still rioting in the streets and rioting outside, more fire. And by 2006, when the figures had continued to climb, you had African Guyanese freedom fighters holed up in Buxton, waging war, where David Hinds and UC Kwara had to leave the village when they said, not in my name, give them credit for that. So the point I am, again, I have to be long-winded as usual, because you can't just pluck these things out of the air. The question will be, is the leadership of the African Guyanese community, are they willing to say, yes, if I want income equity, let us go by measurable metrics. And let us say, okay, as you said, the ethnic impact statement. Let us say the participation in the economy. People talk, for example, there's this one columnist who used to be friends with David. I'm not so sure they're friends anymore. That Indians own 96% of the economy. How could you say such a thing? When Gaisuko is not owned by Indians, look at where Indians, quote unquote, wealth come from. 20,000 sugar workers before Granger fired 5,000 of them, all poverty. No sugar worker has ever bought a car on his own. Bicycle is about as best. You had about 40,000 sugar rice farmers. Thomas himself has shown by his studies that 90% of rice farmers own 5 acres or less. They merely living, can't make a living, and we go on and on. So we got to first of all get some factual statements. Yes, I believe there should be equity and there should be equal opportunity. And I will conclude with this to say I believe African leaders are racist towards African people. And they have bought the English and the European myth that Africans are not, can't make it. I went as a boy in New York City after high school to Brooklyn College, and I lived in Flatbush where all the West Indians were coming. I lived to see Flatbush change from a Jewish neighborhood into a primarily West Indian black. And if you want to talk about house ownership, and if you want to talk about progressiveness, these same people who the black leaders here are telling you you can't compete, they go over there. Don't forget there's a book by the Wyland brothers called In Living Color. They used to mock blacks, including Guyanese. They used to talk about price jobs, and there was a kind of a running about more money, more money, more money. That's all that West Indian people say. So, kind of long story short, there are no quick fixes to these things. And I think shared governance is leading up. Shared governance we have seen is a governance of elites, where they will come to the table and they will cut the pie among themselves. I'm not so sanguine that the wealth ever go down to the masses, and I'm grounded in the masses. I am speaking from the house where I, as a boy, moved from a lodge, and I have located myself into the same house my father built in 1952 with $1,000. So I remain grounded in that community, and I know what the ordinary people want, and they're not looking for handouts.
All right. So, okay. Just so you know,
Hi, Annette.
we have.
Hi, Ravi. Hi, David.
Hi, Annette.
All right. So Annette happens to be, she's wearing several hats. She's a conservationist. She's also an aviator. I don't know many Guyanese or anyone for that matter who actually holds, those two kinds of, qualifications. So she's unique in that sense. But we're happy that you can join us. And I know you have some questions, but I just have a quick question for David, and then we'll come back to you because, as you know, the focus is on how do we move forward and how do we create a working political system in which we can all live together. So David, whether we call this a government of national unity or shared governance or whatever the name might be, I've never heard you say, much about, balancing the armed forces and so on. I know David Granger was in a commission a few years back, and one of the things that commission decided was
2003-4.
Okay, and the recommendation was the force should be modernized, professionalized, and at the same time it should be balanced. I know it was balanced because I wrote a book on a guy named Balram Singh Rai, and he did balance the force. That was he was a PPP minister. So my question to you is, so maybe you can explain because I haven't heard you talk much about creating balance because those are really the institutions of power, right? And if you control that, that's a lot of power that you control. You control the so-called coercive powers in a state.
Ravi and I have had this conversation now for years, and I think we settled it on this program a couple of months ago. Look, if we're going to balance, let's balance. Let's balance the armed forces while we are balancing the money, the wealth. Not, and Ravi knows that income is not necessarily wealth. Black income may have improved, but Black wealth has lagged far behind. So if we are balancing, let's balance. Let's balance politically, let's balance economically, and let's balance the armed forces. I would not advise Indians to give up on wealth without a balancing of the armed forces. And I will not advise Africans to give up their control of the armed forces if there's no balancing of the wealth. So if we're balancing, let's balance down the line. That's my position. Because we're talking here about equity. We're talking about equity, not necessarily just equality, but equity in the resources of the country. That is at the bottom. And where governance is concerned, this is why power sharing is important. Governance is important in a place like Guyana because 50 years after independence, we remain a government-controlled country because government still distribute resources. So if you don't settle the problem of governance, you are unlikely to settle the problem of equity in the armed forces, equity in the economy, etc. So insofar as I support a government of national unity, I don't support it as an end in itself, but as a means to an end. Yes, it's the bourgeois will divide up, but even in one-party government, it's the elites who divide up the government. So any government, whether it's power-sharing government or one-party government, it's the elites, the party elites who divide up the power. And so therefore, we have to see shared governance as a means to an end. The society may outgrow shared governance.
But let me ask you this. I mean, we can balance maybe a police and armed force, but how do you balance or how do you promote equity in wealth? Do you take from one group and allocate to the next?
No, policies. You do vote by policies, Beto. I'm talking about policies. I'm not talking about taking from somebody and giving somebody. You talk about policies. One side is behind. You create policy for that side to catch up. It's not about taking from one. That's not what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about policies. I'm talking here about policies that speak to the racial inequities in the society. And as far as African Guyanese inequities are concerned, they date back long before Indians came to Guyana. They date right back to enslavement. So you're really talking about a historical problem that I think sometimes East Indians are not very much appreciative of. That the African dilemma predates the coming of Indians, and it is deeply ingrained in the structural inequity of the society that we have we got from the time of independence. Let me just say one quick thing. Ravi talked about Granger not sticking to his word. The great Dr. Jagan in 1992 promised that once he got to power, and I'm quoting him, winner take all politics comes to an end. And he said, I will implement the Mandela doctrine of power sharing in South Africa. Dr. Jagan came to power 1992. He died in 1997. He didn't lift a finger. The point I'm making here is not just the black leaders who don't want to accept Indian leadership. Indian leaders also have never accepted black leadership. We've known this, all right? And we have to be very careful of painting one side as the victim and the other side as the aggressor. I embrace the Guyana doctrine of no guilty race.
All right, let me, with that said, I know, Mr. Dev, you want to respond, but let me, I know Annette has been, listening patiently.
Very patient, yes.
So I want to bring her on, and I'm sure she has some questions. The only thing I would ask you, Annette, because these two gentlemen just can't stop talking. So if you can be a little brief with your question, so we can give them more time, because part of what we're doing here is educating each other, so to speak. So the floor is all yours.
So you want me to ask questions of the gentleman at one time, or should I do it separately?
Separately.
Yeah.
Separately. So my first question would be to Ravi. But before I ask the question, you both referred to Guyana's conflict being rooted in our history. But yet both of you forgot a historical fact that Armenians have existed here relatively peacefully for over 10,000 years. You've mentioned that, yes, we are a very important demographic and the fastest growing. I think it's about 11 to 12%. And you also spoke about group legitimacy, but you only spoke about group legitimacy over the past 250 years. So my question to Ravi, and I'm looking forward to the other races being represented in the future conversations as well. But my question to Ravi would be, where do you see the Armenians' place in all of this? Because the whole conversation tonight has been, just basically on the Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese. So Ravi, could you tell me where you see the Armenians' place in all of this?
So when I give you my answer, I put my money where my mouth is. In 2006, I entered into a coalition with the Guyana Action Party. And even though Mr. Hardy protested, it wasn't an Amerindian party, it was, to all intents and purposes, basically an Amerindian party. And I made several statements which are on the record, which I believe that we have to look to a group like the Amerindians who have the legitimacy, and I spoke about this last week, of prior arrival. This is Amerindian country. As a student of law, as a lawyer, I studied the whole notion of sovereignty that the British and the Europeans played around with. That on one hand, in 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia said, any place that is occupied by people, it is not terra nullius, meaning an empty land. Yet when they came here, that's their assumption, that there was nobody there, because they changed the rules of the game to say, well, they have to be civilized. As to who decides what is civilized, they decide that. So the Amerindians were always peripheralized. But to their credit, they were never conquered in Guyana. They had treaties with the Dutch, and so in a sense, they dealt with as equals. I think the Amerindians, as I said at that time, 2006, 2007, needs to be brought to the center of Guyanese politics to take away from this bipolar, destructive politics. Because frankly, I don't see this Indian African thing going away like that. That's why people would like to feel that, you have a few followers and all that. It's very deep seated, and we have to address it. So I think one of the ways we can address it is to have others coming into the picture. And I think the Amerindian population gives us that opportunity. For example, at that time, I said, we should move the capital to the Rupununi. And I had a phrase called "Go South, young man," that Brazil presents a tremendous opportunity. A nation of, I think at that time was 165 million, fifth largest economy at that time, having its travails now, but yet the point is, our hinterland, when Lee Kuan Yew developed Singapore, he defined its hinterland not next door, he defined it thousands of miles away to Europe and America. And I define our hinterland as Brazil. So coming back to your question, I see the Amerindian people and our ethnic security dilemma always brought in the Amerindian security dilemma. When you talk about racism, every group in Guyana, Africans can talk all they want about racism, but the racism against Amerindian people are the worst, as to where they are relegated. I saw African leaders not even give them the consideration to say they were here before. You understand? There's all kinds of theories as to when they actually come in. That's nitpicking. It's nitpicking. So to answer your question, I believe that the Amerindian people should be placed on center stage in terms of our developmental ethos. They have not to be brought up to stuff. They have to be facilitated to rise up. And out of that, I think the others will learn a lesson as to how development can actually happen to our first peoples.
Thank you, Ravi. Just to add, though, that I forgot to mention that if you look at the interracial marriages, you'll see Amerindians have been marrying both races very easily. So there's also another growing demographic. You referred to it earlier as our Creole culture. So not to forget that as well. So if I could go on to David. David, I tend to judge people on their example and not on their rhetoric. So you have been speaking quite a bit tonight about shared governance and all that comes with it. I would want to say that I think that we need statesmen and stateswomen to have that, to achieve that shared governance, and we have to look at some of the harsh realities. So my question to you, David, is if we're looking at shared governance in the broadest context, but if you look at the example of the coalition government from 2015 to present, and their own challenges, some of which you have spoken about quite loudly about prior to the elections. And you mentioned as well to that your party, I'm not asking you to speak as a WPA member, I'm asking you to speak as a Guyanese. You also mentioned that your party had actually inserted the ethnic impact statement in the last manifesto. So my question to you is, if the coalition government is challenged to be efficient and to have that broad consensus among themselves, and how come you lost track of your ethnic impact statement not being a guidance sort of, principle from 2015 to present? Because you speak so powerfully about shared governance, but I think that you sort of dropped the ball in not following up with your ethnic impact statement, which I think would have had a big role to play in the present situation. And you reference as well to that we should look at living with consequences if we don't make the right decisions. I just want to say that, is anybody thinking about the consequences of the 7 weeks of sufferation and the worst to come? Nobody wins in this. All Guyana loses. So over to you for my question.
Yeah, I agree with you. Nobody wins. I don't know when it will end, but I know when it will end, nobody wins. And thank God some of us have been saying that from as early as the second week of this impasse. Nobody is listening. Annette, national consensus in deeply divided societies like ours is never easy. In my study of ethnically divided societies, they've not arrived at a solution easy. It's always been a challenge. Sometimes the groups meet and they part, they meet and they part. It's always a challenge. And yes, my support for the coalition and WPA's support for the coalition was in the context of pushing us towards a government of national unity, that the coalition could have been a bridge, could have been an example of what a government of national unity is. And its failure in that regard, I think has been a colossal blow to the aspirations of national unity. I've said that before, and I'm saying it tonight. But even then, I think we cannot give up. We have to be, and I hear you, rhetoric is not always what you judge people by, but also judge them by actions. We've got to be dreamers and pragmatists at the same time when we're in situations like these. And there's sometimes we have to dream to change the world, to quote Martin Luther, even as we try to change the world. And I think that's where we are. I think what we are fighting for here is to get the ordinary Guyanese people. Ultimately, it's them. It's the Indian people on the quarantine and the African people and the African villages and the Amerindians who ultimately will determine whether we have shared governance or not. And I think often our voice is not as strong as it should be in terms of overpowering some of the extreme voices. I think sometimes our voices get dragged into the extremes. I'm alarmed at how much people say I'm PNC. I am all of this kind of stuff, and I oppose the PNC, oppose the coalition for 4 years.
But
Yeah.
David, can I bring you back to the answer I need, right?
Yeah.
My point is, if you're having so much challenges with managing a coalition government,
Yeah.
how do you expect, if we don't have our votes counted and the government of our choice legally installed, how do you expect the parties moving forward after our votes have been counted? How do you expect the parties to come to the table if there's no trust? So,
Oh,
my
yeah.
point
Yeah.
is about the challenges with the Cummings-Berg Accord that we don't know about and can't be, discussed.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And so on. What I'm saying is that you have a situation where you already have a challenge of a coalition government. You're not you're gonna need trust of the other parties to come to that table. How do you see us achieving that? Be realistic. Don't tell me
Yeah.
to dream.
Annette, I'm not opposed to people counting their votes. My vote is in that box too, and I would like it to be counted. I'm saying that at critical times in our history, we sometimes have to forego these grandiose ideas. During the PNC time, our votes weren't counted, but we came to the table for a solution in 1990. This thing that you have to count the votes before you have a solution, I totally disagree with. It happens in some circumstances, but I think in deeply stressed society, these niceties of democracy, sometimes we have to get around them in order to get a solution. I repeat, in 1990, if we have the same rhetoric about our votes being counted before we have a solution, we would have never had a solution. I'm not opposed to people's votes. Oh, not at all. Not at all. I'm saying that in this instance, counting the votes will lead to more entrenched problems. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I don't have in a few weeks to say, I told you so.
Let me interject for a minute, and we have to go to the commercial break. But before we do that, I just want to ask Mr. Dev a quick question. You have touted this whole concept of federalism. I like the idea of moving Guyana's capital into the interior. It's not unusual. Brazil has moved, from Rio into Brasilia to encourage people to develop the interior. But is your idea of federalism for Guyana, is that still relevant?
It is, because first of all, when you make constitutional change, you can't be changing your constitutions as we try to do every time the PLC comes out and beats up some people in the streets of Georgetown. You have to look ahead. Guyana, with its newfound oil wealth, not worth much right now, but it's still there. We have an opportunity to, in a sense, fund our development, all the dreams we had. And we can't see Guyana remaining underpopulation as it is. We have to look to the future. What federalism does is several things, but the main one is that in federalism, you have a matrix of power, not one central power like we have in Georgetown. Part of the problem in societies such as ours is that the central government is so powerful that people will do anything to capture it, and we have seen how far they can go. Lie in front of the entire nation and tell their people that black is white. They'll go that far. So, but if in federalism you now have a matrix of center where you have different parts of the country in charge of their own development, in charge of their own budget, and all the other things that goes with a federal system, it then removes power, the power struggle. But secondly, and most importantly, and fortuitously, our ethnic groups tend to be concentrated in different areas. So fortuitously, it will allow, for example, for the first time, Amerindians in certain huge swaths of Guyana to actually run affairs. When I proposed that Paul Hardy be the presidential candidate of the Gap Roar, people said, "What? I'll be crude on thing. How you will let a black man, be the presidential candidate?" You see, that's the kind of racism we have, and it's very deeply inbred. So what federalism will do would be not to have this racial thing that all of us got to be paternalistic to the Amerindians and give handouts as they right now do a little boat engineer, a little, paddle down there, expect you to vote for them. They will be able to form their own development. Similarly, Afro-Guyanese will have to be in charge of where they are the most populous and will be in charge of their own destiny. So it's not that it will not be a do or die situation anymore. So federalism offers many benefits. And those who talk about the cost are inordinate. This present regional system has more manpower and more cost. But because it doesn't have the simplest, the most profound aspect of federalism, which is that you must have separate competencies. That in federalism, by constitutional mandate, the separate organs have what they can do. The states have what they can do and what the federal government can get involved in. So you can, in a sense, be free to develop. So, for example, I was once passing Denamsil with. I had been imprisoned in 1989 after Mr. Hoyt did the 10-to-1 devaluation, and Mr. Quayana and the lawyer, what's his name, for the WPA, came at the Lenore station and we were driving back. And I pointed to Denamsil as we were passing. And I said, man, look how the Denamsil is so underdeveloped. And Mr. Hoyt and Mr. Quayana told me, he said, Mr. Dev, that the African people have their own aesthetics of how they live. They live in harmony with nature. And from that, I learned a very big lesson that day. So, for example, we will see how each of our people will begin to live. For example, I think we have a lot to learn from Amerindians again. And that was, if you go back to the Gap Roar campaign, we put out a lot of that, to be in tune with nature, to be in tune with our land, to be one with our whole country, really.
All right, I have a whole bunch of questions, but I feel like these two gentlemen have filibustered me to a great extent. So
you allow them.
No, but like I said, I think this is they're doing a great service to everyone who's watching. But we do have to go to a commercial break from Globespan, and if I can just ask all of you to kind of prepare a closing statement. So we'll come back after the break.
Did you know the FBI warned against using public Wi-Fi? And hackers using public Wi-Fi can download viruses and steal all of your private information. Let Globespan help you protect against hackers by providing you with a virtual private network or VPN. Keep all of your data hidden and protected, including sensitive information, documents, bank account numbers, and more. The FBI recommends using a VPN, and Globespan can help provide one for you. It's very simple and easy to use. Call Globespan today. In Georgetown, call 225-9054. In West Coast, call 269-0141. Or in the United States, call 718-551-3290. You are now able to work from home or from anywhere with a cloud computer. No more worrying if you can't get to the office. Access all of your files and work in an efficient manner with a cloud computer. Best of all, no waiting for a technician to show up to fix all of your computer crashes or viruses, or any computer problem. No more worrying about power surge or losing your files. Let Globespan set up a cloud computer for you to work from home or anywhere. Access with a laptop, iPad, or any device that you may have. You can set up your own passwords and keep all your information hidden. Globespan will set up all the antivirus programs, automatic backups, and configure a computer to fit your needs. Globespan has technicians in the US and Guyana to assist you. Call Globespan today. In Georgetown, call 225-9054. In West Coast, call 269-0141. Or in the United States, call 718-551-3290.
Once again, we just want to remind you that Globespan would like to continue to have these kinds of serious discussion about the problems we're dealing with in Guyana. So we're kind of close to the edge of our time here. So I'm going to ask, I guess I can ask Annette first to give a closing statement, and then we'll go to David, and then Mr. Dev.
All right, thank you very much. So, I'll be brief. In terms of all that we spoke about tonight, I think it's not enough to dream. I think we have to be realistic about the challenges, and I think that we have to be aware that this has to be an inside job. It has to be inside our leaders. They have to be genuinely to share governance and turn the rhetoric into reality. I think as well too that we need to start focusing more on our Guyanese identity. The shift in demographics is positive in that regard, and we need to focus a whole lot more on what we stand to lose by ripping our fabric even further, and how much we need to come together to actually gain. Our youth right now, it's their futures we are playing around with, and I think we are doing them a great injustice. That if we can't win, let's destroy everything and leave nothing for them to move forward on. So thank you, gentlemen, for having me. Thank you, Ravi and David, for being consistent as well and being willing to speak to each other. And I would appeal to the Guyanese. We could agree to disagree, but we should never stop speaking to each other. Thank you.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, history has dealt us the hand that we have before us today, and we can't go back and change that history. We've got to deal with the consequences of our historical journey. And ultimately, I think we can overcome the difficulty that we have found ourselves in. And there are all kinds of different forces which should come to play to take us forward as a united and dignified people. There is a role for the fighters who are fighting and have been fighting for 50 days. There is a role for them too, the warriors. But there is also a role for other voices like ours, other voices that are bold enough to come forward and to say something differently and to put proposals put proposals on the table that may disturb the political correctness out there. Because Bob Marley says, I want to disturb my people. I want to disturb my neighbor. And I think sometimes we have to disturb the narrative. We have to disturb the in thing. I think we are in the moment of a quick fix. Quick fix, the easy way out. Today, and not seeing how that will lead to difficulty tomorrow and the next day. And I come down on the side of no quick fix. That this has been a gathering storm for centuries, and it cannot be solved in a day and by a declaration. It has to be solved by a commitment of all Guyanese to ensuring that we stay together as a nation.
Dev?
Well, I need to take a different tact. And what this is that we in Guyana would be very tiny, but even because of that tininess, we have to recognize we are operating in what is called a world system. And this whole liberal notion that you can create institutions, and through institutions, you can regulate society so that there are no conflicts. Very sadly, we may have to say that very sadly, we have now seen that that has fallen apart. The liberal consensus has fallen apart. And what is happening is that nationalism, identity politics is now sweeping the world, and places that gave us this whole liberal notion, like England, Europe, America, they are now grappling with this thing called identity. As Jesse Jackson used to say, this whole notion of, let's just say, I am somebody, whoever I am. So in America, you see poor whites or the alienated whites rejecting the liberal, consensus. Trump might be exploiting it, but he's exploiting something that is there. Mr. Johnson in England may be exploiting it, but he's exploiting that reaction by Brits against the Poles and others. So we in Guyana don't have to be embarrassed about our ethnic differences and the fact that we are different. The question is that for 2 centuries or even more, we were told that liberal vision that everything has to be one. E pluribus unum, out of many one. But I come from a tradition which says eko hum bahusiyam, that God was one. And he said to himself, let there be many. Therefore, this creation given to us by God is diverse. And our problem is an opportunity that we in Guyana can begin to show the world that we can live with our diverse population as a source of strength. The only thing is that we can't start at all, we got to be one and it'll be one love. We have to begin from the starting point is that how do we deal with diversity? How do we deal, not to obliterate it, not to Christianize every Amerindian, not to say that they are the indigenous culture, not to wipe out African culture from African people, not to tell the Indians you're a heathen, and just before the elections, one pastor would say that our Jandi flags is causing cars to crash on the road. This kind of attitude leads to contempt. Changes in political change can only come after changes in cultural and social consciousness. And I tell you this, that I want to end with this. Let us now know that we have an opportunity to hear. And as Annette encouraged us, let's call a spade a spade. After what David Granger, we cannot tell African Guyanese who to pick as their leaders, as Mr. Kwame once cautioned me after 98, that we can't tell the African people whether they choose Hoyt or not. He wouldn't like that, but that's who they chose. But I'm telling you, what Mr. Granger has done is to destroy in the minds of most right-minded people that he's a serious person in terms of sharing and living out this dream. And the worst part of it, he has been proven to be hypocritical. He's been totally hypocritical about it. And that's the worst damage that he has done. To destroy our social compact, called the Constitution. You know how? There's something called the basic structure in a Constitution, which summarizes all we stand for, that we, the people of this land, are sovereign. But when you can play around with our Constitution and see it as a point of merit to do what you're doing today, it destroys any kind of accommodation. So I'm hoping that we will now go forward, but no, don't go forward with rose-tinted glasses. I don't believe the PNC will give up. I think they will fight this thing to, quote unquote, to the death. To the death. As Mr. Rowley said, it's not going to end well. And I have deep forebodings, as I wrote in 90, and I said in 93, I'm going to say it again.
Well, gentlemen, this has been really educational. And I know. I was going to come to you in a minute.
Yeah, right.
And thanks for correcting me. I do want to say that, it's been very in-depth and very detailed. And I think we have to consider this for what it is. It's a serious discussion about where we are. And I hope that it continues and all of us have to be included. And I think, as Annette rightfully brought forward to our attention, is we need to consider the role of the Amerindians, in this multicultural, multi-ethnic society. They are, after all, about 12% of the population, and it's one of the fastest growing population in the country. So Guyana really is a country of minorities. We don't have a majority ethnic population. Nobody has 50%. So Annette, I appreciate what the fact that you brought forward these realities to us, and I'm hoping through Globespan that we can continue to have these kinds of discussion. And as I said, I do appreciate all of your frankness and honesty about where we are in dealing with this situation. And Annette, I will look forward to your pictures as you always post about the environment. It's a learning process for me to see what you guys do. And again, I want to thank you for joining us tonight, and hopefully you can do that again. So on behalf of Globespan, I would like to say good night to everyone. Please stay safe. And hopefully we can meet again. Good night.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Take care. See ya.